All right, well, welcome. So this is Introduction to Volumetric Video Capture. I'm Francesca Albrezzi. I'm in the Office of Advanced Research Computing here at UCLA. I am manager of the GIS and Visualization Research Technology Group. And like I said, this session will be recorded today. So if you have to hop off a little early, that's okay. It will be posted on our OARC YouTube channel. You may also notice that there is a second version of me in the Zoom room. That is not an error. I will be switching back and forth between computers for some demoing and need to use a higher performance computer in order to do that. So that is why there's two of me in the session. So bear with me as I switch back and forth between my monitors at that point in the workshop. So I'll get started with a roadmap of what we're going to cover today. We're diving into volumetric video capture, or as I like to call it, video with a Z-axis. So here's what I have for our time together. We'll start off with some fundamentals. We'll start with an introduction, a quick primer on what volumetric data actually is, comparing point clouds and texture to texture meshes, just so that we're kind of all on the same page, speaking the same technical language here. We'll then dive into some stuff about workflow. I'll attempt to pull back the curtain here a bit on the tech stack. When you're doing this kind of work, there's really a sequence of things that have to happen, and you have to have the equipment and the software to be able to work in this area. So we'll look at the hardware array that you'll need, or different kinds of arrays that you might be considering to sync multiple sensors, and then the software pipeline required to turn that raw depth data into playable 3D assets. We'll then also talk about current modalities and tools. So we'll look at the where and the how of going about this type of work. We will compare professional grade multi-camera studios to the emerging world of mobile LiDAR and consumer depth sensors. This section is really going to be about finding the right tool for your specific budget and environment. So I'll give you a couple of options there for you to consider if you're getting started in this area. And I've got a few research examples a few use cases that I want to take a look at together, just to sort of inform us how our peers are already using this to measure human movement and create social presence. And then finally, at the end, we'll do a reality check. We sort of can't forget about the hurdles. Volumetric data is notoriously heavy and often noisy. And so I want to make sure that we draw attention to the massive, file sizes, the ethics to consider when working in this way, and to create in really creating digital doubles, right? And I am an enthusiast. I'm someone that really enjoys working in this area, but I wouldn't necessarily say I'm an expert. I always feel like I'm learning as well. And so I would love to wrap up with a discussion if people are interested in sharing what they're working on or their own interests. I'd love to hear how these tools might fit into the kind of work or upcoming work that you have in mind. And if people want more information on certain things, please let me know. I'll try to add that to my slide deck when I send out my slide deck at the end of the session. And, we're always looking for feedback on how we can better these workshops. So I am going to, I'll share this link again at the end of the workshop, but I'm going to share it now as well for our workshop assessment, so that we can get some feedback from you all on how these sessions are working for you, if they're meeting your expectations, and what else you might like as part of these workshops. So when I was completing my dissertation on how immersive technologies were being used in museums, cultural heritage, and artistic context, I was really interested in how spatial capture was becoming increasingly used both to document and also engage audiences. So some examples that stood out for me that I want to share or just use as a jumping off point for us today. the first one is over here on the left, called Dust by Maria Judova and Andrzej Boleslavsky, I believe is how you pronounce his last name. And this was done in 2017. So it's a 4-minute long immersive virtual reality experience where you are placed in the immediate presence of a dancer, and it's like within this unique visual and oral scenario that's created by capturing volumetric recordings of dancers and photogrammetric imagery of this specific building. And you're able to sort of experience the work from different perspectives, right? You're in it, you're part of it, and you're able to move around within it. And so the dance is something that you're almost in connection with, right? As a user within the experience. There's also the Dimensions and Testimony project that's been going on at USC, which created interactive volumetric biographies with Holocaust survivors. They're designed as conversational interactions with eyewitnesses to history to learn from those who were there, right? So you're able to use sort of pick from certain natural language questions, right? That then prompt a response based on what conversations have been captured, and that clip will play back for you. I think the first interview was done in 2014, I believe, and they're expanding out that repository still. And then finally, the DALI Lives project, which you're seeing some samples of down here in this video. This was just after I completed my dissertation. Of course, you know how projects come out right after you finish your research, that you're like, oh, I wish I had gotten to talk about that. But this is a really interesting installation that was done by the Salvador Dali Museum in 2020. And it employs AI to, quote unquote, resurrect the Spanish surrealist Salvador Dali, who lived from 1904 to 1989. So has long since passed. But the experience allows visitors to interact with a lifelike digital imitation of the artist on screen throughout the museum, so that you can learn things about him, his life, his artistic legacy, really. And the creation team made use of both archival footage, interviews, and writings from the artist to train an AI model that is part of the experience, right? In addition to that, though, an actor with similar features was used to add to the realism of the performance. And so that was, I believe, done with a volumetric capture. And so there's this kind of melding that's happening, and we're seeing this more and more to create these immersive-like experiences with volumetric capture as part of that equation. So I should just to round out here. So it's through projects like these that I'm coming to this work, and I've been inspired, and they've really fascinated me in many different ways. And knowing how it's done is an important part of understanding and analyzing this type of work. So with that in mind, I want to just slow us down for a second here and talk about what is volumetric capture. So traditional video records what a lens sees, right? And then volumetric capture records a space, allowing us to move through this recording as if it was a live environment. For researchers, this means moving away from the limitations of the flat screen into a world of spatial data. So again, traditional video is this projection of light, right? And volumetric capture is the process of capturing three-dimensional space or objects in real time, resulting in a digital representation that can be viewed from any different, any angle, really, depending on how immersively or how much data you're able to capture. So, when we're talking about volumetric capture, we're thinking about the ways that we're moving from 2D to 6 degrees of freedom. you might have heard this DOF, 3 DOF or 6 DOF. So when we're talking about 6 DOF, we're really thinking about uh, uh, creating an environment where a user can move forward, backward, left, right, up and down, right, within the footage itself, essentially. And then there's this additional aspect of temporal data when we're talking about volumetric video, right, where there's the time aspect. So unlike static 3D scanning, volumetric capture recordings also record movement or motion over time, creating this like living digital asset, right? So that's it's an additional measure that we are considering. And when we look at the scale of the data as a result of that, right, it significantly increases the kind of file sizes we're working with. So we'll talk more about that in a second. So in terms of the anatomy of the data, I want to get into the weeds a little bit more in a minute, but usually you'll be converting and working with either point clouds or meshes. And you want to choose your data format based on the project's needs. So for example, point clouds are better for spatial analysis and raw measurement, and texture meshes tend to be better for immersive UX and human interaction studies. But why might you even consider using volumetric capture for research, right? What's the point of working in this way for research? Well, first and foremost, spatial accuracy. You can capture micro expressions and precise body language that 2D video might obscure, right? Might not get to the same degree in terms of measurement. So for example, you're looking to track how well someone's range of motion is improving with physical therapy, right? If you're able to have a 3D capture of them lifting their arm, every week and seeing how that rotator cuff is doing, right, with a specific weight, you can actually then measure that quite significantly if you've captured it volumetrically. Reproducibility is another one. Replaying a human performance infinitely from any perspective to gather different data points can be very useful. Perhaps you're filming a very intense fight choreography scene, and instead of your actors having to perform it repeatedly so that you can capture different shot types, wide, medium, close up, you could have them do it once, and then you could choose the shots in post-production in dialogue with your editor, see the scene play out in different ways, and either use that as a method. Maybe you don't use the actors at that initial step. Maybe you're using the stunt doubles, and then you're figuring out where you want the camera so that when you go and you shoot it for production, you have an idea of exactly what you want, and you've been able to play out all those scenarios digitally beforehand, right, to really make sure that that's what you want, saving you production time and money. And then there's providing subjects with highly realistic stimuli in VR and AR environments. So perhaps you're doing a psychology study around facing fears, and you have participants who are afraid of horses that you want to have them complete some kind of exposure therapy, but doing it in VR, right? Lifelike volumetric videos of horses can cut back on risk in a lot of different ways, including, a participant reaction to the horses, right? Where they might get injured from being around a horse, right? Or the horse itself getting spooked and putting the participant at risk. So things like that could be very, very useful as an intermediary step before bringing someone to a barn, right? To interact with a horse directly. So we'll talk about some other use cases and applications in depth later, but I wanted you to just get a sense of the possibilities from what I just described. Okay, so now that we know the what, let's talk about the heavy lifting, the sort of technical stack here. So to create a volumetric recording, we have to solve a fundamental problem, which is how do we turn a flat image into a coordinate, essentially, or a set of coordinates. So to capture volume, we need more than just color, we need distance data. Most research setups use depth sensors like the Azure Kinect. I'm going to show you an example of this later, but this workshop does come with props. So here's an example of what the Azure Kinect looks like. It's fairly light. I've got a little tripod on it here, but you can, screw these on to, and then they have, your connectors happen in the back. So very lightweight, right? And these cameras don't just see color, they shoot out a field of infrared light that bounces off the subject to calculate distance. So you can see some of the specs here, right? You're able to also capture sound. Not all of these capture devices have sound, so that's something that if you're interested in, you do want to consider what devices you're purchasing, if sound is an important part of your project. And you're able to sync these devices up in order to then capture a full 360 of an object or a scene. Let's talk a little bit about another kind of hardware. You've got also passive stereo. So this uses multiple RGB cameras to calculate depth via parallax. So this is similar to how the human eye works. The movement here is happening, or I'm sorry, the improvement here of this technology is happening very rapidly. The picture above is me standing in a sort of volumetric capture array back in 2019 at Google. And so you can see there's every single one of these little light things is a camera. And then I'm holding a mirrored ball that allows you to see the rest of, it's a whole spherical capture, right? And there's this little entrance right here, this little place where you kind of duck in, but everything else is covered in cameras. So that's what we were looking at in 2019. That's what was being used for high-end volumetric capture in 2019. Most of the time we were looking at just image capture. We weren't really doing a lot of video, or I wasn't seeing a lot of video back at that time. Now, only a couple of years later, really less than a decade later, the video on the bottom shows Canon, and I'll play it again so that you can see, shows Canon's small format system. And ASU is deploying a new prototype of this small format volumetric system from Canon, which uses synchronized imaging and Gaussian splatting to transform live human motion into 3D video, enabling researchers, into new workflows. And it's really amazing. I mean, you're seeing these are, iPhones. They're able to do this with just phones. And I think their rig only uses, in this case, 20 cameras. So a lot less than what you were seeing here in terms of syncing all of that, all the data that's involved in that. And you're seeing examples of the capture. It's quite good, right? It's the quality is getting better and better. And so researchers are really focusing on reducing the number of cameras needed in order to do this kind of volumetric capture work. At USC, they're developing techniques that use only a single standard camera, so monocular, to achieve real-time high-fidelity volumetric performance capture. You're seeing samples of that here. And it's really kind of incredible, right? That you're able to generate, or it's through, now expanding into the use of AI as well, right? That we're able, these capture methods are able to intuit the rest of the figure based on the video that it's seeing. And I do want to mention in that regard, DeepMind recently introduced D4RT, which is an AI model that unifies dynamic scenes or unifies dynamic scene reconstruction and tracking into a single efficient framework for better, faster 4D, meaning 3D plus time volumetric video. So DART utilizes a unified transformer architecture to jointly infer depth, spatiotemporal correspondence, and a full video or full camera parameters from a single video, right? So it's able to take a video that you've shot and infer kind of the space of the figures within the video. So we're starting to see, rather than replacing the hardware, AI is now being used to compress data and fill gaps between camera views and enable real-time streaming, which is pretty incredible. And I also want to mention LiDAR, pulse-based laser scanning for high-precision environmental mapping. This is more motion capture than volumetric, but for example, companies like Movin are delivering real-time markers, markerless motion capture using single device powered by LiDAR and AI. And you can sort of see, right, this is the figure, the person who's doing the kind of movement, and it's able to interact live with an avatar within a VR space. So the setup just takes a couple of minutes, but the results are quite astonishing, right? And you can see the LiDAR device itself is fairly small and lightweight. So, it allows for more lifelike capturing of movements for avatars within immersive spaces, but it could also be used to document choreography or analyze different performances of the same choreography, right? To see how different performers are adapting movement based on their own personal style or aesthetic. So I can see a number of uses for this type of technology. So then let's talk about a typical volumetric capture pipeline. It'll look something like this. And again, this is very pared down, but in order to generalize, but it can summarize sort of what you should expect if you're working in volumetric capture. So you're going to do some kind of calibration and sync, right? You're going to align all your cameras to a single coordinate system and ensure they trigger at the same millisecond, right? At the exact same moment in order to do your capture. Otherwise, things are going to look kind of jiggled in your resulting capture. So that coordination is critical. Then you'll have this capture and background subtraction that's going to have to happen, where you're isolating the subject from the noise of the room. When you do this kind of capture, we'll see in just a second when I demo it, the whole environment can be part of it. And really you can adjust the depth sensors on your devices in order to clear out that extra data. You can also do editing in the aftermath that will also clear out that extra data before export so that you're not dealing with so much data. Then there's some kind of reconstruction that has to happen, right? So fusing multiple camera views into a single 3D representation for that export. And there's then a compression and encoding that needs to happen to convert the raw 3D data into formats that are playable by game engines or whatever output that you're headed for, but typically it's some kind of game engine. So it needs to be exported as an MP4 with geometric data and usually textures as well. We're going to get into the demo portion. I'll switch to my other monitor in just a second here and share from that screen. But I just want to give you an example of, my hardware array or my typical hardware array, what it might look like. And then I'll give you this demo get a sense of how it all works together. But I would really recommend working with a wide screen display if you can, if you have access to one, one that is 4 or 5K, if possible. You really need to be able to move the capture area around while maintaining a full view, and that's very helpful for that. I use an Intel i7 7th generation minimum with 16 gigabytes of RAM with an external solid state drive, 1 terabyte of data at least available, because doing this work, it's just a data eater, right? It's going to eat up data space quite quickly. So you really do need to have some kind of external drive, typically, where this data can go, especially if you're doing, a couple minutes worth, if not longer. And you'll see why when we do this capture in a second, kind of what the rates are there that you're dealing with in terms of the amount of data that you're capturing. Microsoft Azure Kinect DK, again, is what I'm going to be demoing today, using with a free Depthkit software license, which only supports a single camera and 30 seconds of recording. So again, we're doing a maybe scaled down version of this today, just to give you a sense. But ultimately, you would have multiple of these set up right around your subject in order to do that capture. I do have linked in my notes as well for this presentation tutorials on live streaming. So you can live stream from these devices as well if you wanted to. So to get a volumetric live stream going, that is possible with these cameras or these depth sensors. And so I have tutorials linked to walk you through that if that's something you're interested in. And we can always meet and do a consultation if that's something you're interested in doing. Important to note here that you really do need a 3060 RTX GPU at minimum to do this kind of work. You really need that additional processing power. So again, take a look at the specs of the devices that you're working with, and let me know if you have any questions. I can always double check for you if you're not sure. So I'm going to stop sharing on one side and start sharing on the other. So what you're looking at now is the Depthkit sort of main screen. So when you open Depthkit, when you download the software and you open Depthkit, you open a new project and you're going to have these view panels. So, and I have one of the cameras you can sort of maybe see in the upper right hand. You can see I have the Azure Kinect that's pointing directly down at me. And so you're seeing me in my environment here in my office. So on the view panel, there's various previews. And so we're just going to go through what's here. You have your main view panel here where you're going to be able to see it's basically your capture preview. You have a color preview, you have a depth preview, and then you have some options here that you can adjust depending on the view preview that you want to see. So for example, it sort of starts you in mesh. If I zoom in here, you kind of see, right? And then if I switch over here, this is previewing me as a point cloud now. So you can see the difference in the actual data capture that's happening. You also can show texture surfaces. That's always turned on, but you can also show as shaded surfaces, right? Both in mesh or in point cloud, and show surface normals, as well as toggling on the wireframes. So why do you need all these things? Well, the benefit of having this is to look for holes, right? To really be able to drag around your scene. If you have multiple cameras set up, to identify where you might not be getting coverage. And then make sure that you're adjusting your cameras as much as possible to avoid those holes or odd overlaps, right? Again, it's all about kind of lining things up so that your capture comes out as clear as possible. I do want to mention then over here, the sensor configuration, that's where you would see if you had multiple devices, right? You would be able to see the multiple devices that are connected, and you can control that configuration there. You'll see within just with the one Azure Kinect, right? And I should say, you should be able to just plug in the device and that comes up. With different devices, you may have to download like the Azure Kinect SDK. If you were using, I'll show you an alternative device in just a second. That's doesn't give you quite the same quality, but you know, again, depending on what you're doing, you might want to use instead. But with that device, you may have to download the Azure Kinect SDK for it to be recognized by this system. But once that's installed, then it should show up as an option here to connect. And then this is where you can control essentially how you want that capture to go, right? So you can adjust for the quality, what level, right? And that again is dependent on your device. So in this case, I can, I'm going to stick with 1080 here, but you can, go down if resolution doesn't matter as much to you, right? We'll shift the quality a little bit. You can also aspect ratio, right? So again, depending on what you're capturing for, what your output is, you may want to adjust the aspect ratio. And same with narrow versus wide. I'll just give you a sample here. If we switch to wide, right? Obviously, more data is being captured. You're getting a wider sense of my environment, right? If we're narrow, and then there's narrow raw versus narrow averaged. Again, depending on how much quality and how much data you're looking to deal with. When you're in these settings, you can also adjust just like you could on a normal camera, you can adjust things like exposure or white balance or brightness. So let me switch out of here. You can go back to a more realistic view, and let me turn off the wireframe here. So I just turned up the brightness, right? So now I'm very overexposed. But you can also turn it down. So depending on what environment you're capturing in. Sorry, that's a strange angle of my face, but you get the idea. Contrast can adjust as well, depending on saturation, sharpness, all of that can be adjusted as you would with, kind of typical camera settings. In, backlight compensation, perhaps, depending again on your environment, your capture environment. These advanced settings in terms of power line frequency, you're probably almost never going to need to work with these, but again, depending on what your environment is, what you're plugging into, and how many cameras you have operating, you may go down to 50 hertz, but typically you'll stay at 60 hertz. Now, when you record, that recording will show up in your recordings library, and you can open that project folder. You can take a view or a video, and you can see how many videos that you have outlined here in your recording library. You can obviously name your videos. And then what I think I really want to point out here is your preview depth range. So I can demonstrate, or I can cut off parts of my video so that I'm not capturing to a certain depth. So I can cut out that background, and all of a sudden I'm capturing far less data, right? A lot less data than I would if I was recording my, the full range. I can also do it the other way, right? So if I wanted to remove myself from the scene and just capture the background, you can just see that beautiful yarn work in the background. That's possible too. So you can, again, adjust that preview depth range to control what you're capturing, the level to which you're capturing. And again, you may do that based on your environment if you have multiple things set up, and that way you don't have to worry about green screening everything, right? That's okay. If someone's standing around, that's okay. You can take them out just using the depth range application here. Now, this is a previous video that I did. You can see that that take is here. I've isolated myself, and I have about, you can see where I was sitting, right? The kind of capture that's possible. It's fairly simple, right? This is about 30 seconds worth. But I do actually, let me go back to recording so that you can see that we do one ourselves live. So obviously here in your record panel versus your editor panel is where you'll see your record button. And I might just look at my camera and give you a quick wave, right? And stop the recording. So not a very long recording, but you'll see why in just a second. So we'll go into the editor here. And you can see that previous recording of 30 seconds. And then you've got this second recording here. So if you click here and go into properties, you'll see for this take that I just did, that was about 13 megabytes. If I go over to this one that was 30 seconds long from earlier this week, and I check on the properties, you'll see that's almost, it's about 250 megabytes. Significant data, right? Significant amount of data, and that's only 30 seconds. So if we doubled that, if we thought we were going to do about a minute capture, you're looking at a half a gigabyte of data. And that's only with one device, right? So imagine having multiple devices set up around a subject. You start to see the exponential growth of the amount of data that you're dealing with. So it's quite significant, and it's something to keep in mind when you're working in these environments, right? Or working with this kind of data. And let me see, I'm just gonna, there we go. Now we can look at my capture. So I just had to double click on this in order to, it was getting a little stuck here. So this is the capture that I just did, right? You see me wave. But you can see it's capturing depth, right? Same thing here with this 30-second clip. I've removed the background, so we're not getting that extraneous data. You can see the original environment here, right? But I was able to use that depth, my depth editor, to cut off that background so you're not seeing any of that, and you're getting a much clearer capture for the video. Make sense? Now, again here, I've chosen to cut that depth down. I could bring it back so that you get more of my environment before export, or I can cut it low and export from there. And then when you get into export, you not only can choose the location, obviously, but you can select the type. So again, you want to think of what environment am I moving this to, and select based on that. So you do want to think about, do you want your textured geometry as part of what you're exporting? Do you want it combined? Do you want things separate? You can also think about the environment to which it's going in terms of, like, are you going into the Apple Pro, Meta Quest, right, or custom? Typically, you're probably going to go into another environment. I'm going to show some examples of bringing something into Unity. And typically, you're going to go into some kind of game engine, probably. You probably don't want to just export from here directly into a Meta Quest, but perhaps you might, depending. And then you have some advanced settings here that, again, that you can adjust, but most of the time you'll have set that prior. in terms of your capture, right? Any questions about that? Okay. I did want to just mention too, maybe how to delete a recording. So in, in your recordings library, you can come up here and hit the little trash can icon. And when you do that, it will remove all associated media files. So keep that in mind if you're, working in this area, that you do want to make sure that you're okay with the whole thing getting removed, right? And before moving on to the next slide here, I just want to reiterate again. So, if you're doing with one camera, we're thinking like 5 to 7 gigabytes at the highest rate per minute. That's a significant amount of data. So again, it's something to consider in doing this work. So once you've completed your volumetric capture, you're gonna want to bring it into a platform where you can prepare it for the type of experience that you're looking to build. And as I mentioned, you can do some basic editing within Depthkit, and I'm sharing additional documentation here. This first link here is specifically around how you can edit within Depthkit. There are ways that I started to show you, but you can also do some cropping as well within their toolkit. But it is limited. So you're going to want to bring your exports into a platform, maybe like Unity or Unreal, where you can add to a scene and design it for something like a headset experience. So Unity is a platform that's been around since 2025. It's a real-time 3D development platform for building 2D and 3D applications like games and simulations. As a cross-platform game engine, it supports development in a variety of outputs, such as desktop, mobile, console, augmented reality, and virtual reality, right? So you can do a lot of things with Unity if you become proficient in Unity. I will say there is a steep learning curve. So it's something that if you're planning on getting into it, it's going to take a little while to get off the ground. But once you do, there's a lot that you can do with it. And Unity has expanded to serve all these various applications by the use of expansion plugins, typically. So the second and third points here on the slide are links to Unity's documentation, or Unity and Depthkit's documentation on implementing the Depthkit Core and Depthkit Studio Unity expansion. So there's some plugins there that you'll need in order to be able to do that. So just please keep in mind, if you're starting from scratch, that you have to download and install Unity Hub and then Unity Engine, and make sure everything is configured correctly for compatibility. Plugins don't always get updated at the same time as the Unity software, so you may have to install an older version from the Unity archive, and I have included that link within my slide notes if you're looking for it. But that way you can make sure that everything works together. And again, if you run into any issues, you can reach out. I'm always happy to help with that. But these tutorials that are linked here will walk you through how to import a volumetric capture into a scene in Unity, and also how to how to stream from outside of a Unity project. So for example, this one down below here, you can be using something like Depthkit to stream into Unity for an experience. And that'll walk you through that. But I do just want to take a minute to quick demo a Depthkit Studio in Unity for you, so you get a sense of like what's possible here, why you might, what do the results look like when you bring them out of something like Depthkit into a platform like Unity. And in order to do this, you would sign up for a Depthkit account. You can do that for free. You can download Unity Hub and Engine, again, for free. And then you're going to want to go to depthkit.tv/downloads to get sample files. Now, you can only get those sample files once you have logged into your Depthkit account. So you do have to set up an account before you can do that. But once you've done that, you can bring in these samples and play around with them without needing to get any plugins set up within Unity. They'll automatically play. So this is a good way for you to find out if your computer can handle these types of files. And then once you're there, you're going to press play in the game window and click through some samples. So I will again transition to my other computer to show you that and show you an example of what a 10 depth sensor capture looks like when it's brought into Unity. So let me quick switch back. Okay, so this is Unity, as you can see. It is not a lightweight tool. It's a heavy, a beast of a tool, but it's incredible what you can do with it, and fantastic for creative projects. Once you've loaded in the sample, you're able to come up here to the play button. It's just going to take a second here to pull up. And this particular example uses a similar tool to the Azure Kinect. It's a Orbeck bolt depth sensor, Meadow bolt depth sensor, about 10 of them. And so here we go. So now we're seeing this fashion model, right? We have some options here of various different looks of this fashion model who's modeling, and I can actually able to click and drag around this capture video. I can zoom in using the scale feature so I can get a better sense of the kind of detailing here, right? So as you get closer, obviously the detailing doesn't quite look as good from out here, but you are seeing, so essentially this is 30 frames per second, 1440 color capture. It's on narrow raw depth and pretty incredible in terms of getting a sense of, the clothes on the form. It really does feel like, it's quite lifelike in terms of the capture, right? And you can see, again, that depth sensor at play, how she kind of comes out of nowhere. That's based on the depth of what's being captured. But the movement is, right, looks like real human movement. It doesn't look like an avatar's movement. It looks like real human movement. And so, again, depending on the kind of experience you're building, this type of tool is incredibly powerful. This is just a quick slide from Mod Tech Labs from a 2020 article of tips and tricks for volumetric capture. I'm not really going to go and spend a lot of time here because I think it's pretty standard for most 3D capture. But obviously, there are specific things to keep in mind to set yourself up for good results, or at least making sure you're aware of things that might be challenging, like shiny surfaces or thin objects. So for example, hat brims, that's not going to look great typically in volumetric capture. So you might not want people to wear a baseball cap when they're working with you in that volumetric video. These are just the standard things that whether you're doing, photogrammetry or LiDAR or working with depth sensors, that this technology tends to, have some issues with, right? Or gets a little finicky around. But it also depends on your hardware, right? It really, really depends on the kind of technology that you're using, and that will affect the outcome and the quality. So I want to talk a little bit about the spectrum here. There's, professional studios and high-end rigs that I'm going to talk about on the next slide. The kind of quality that you can get now from these things, it's quite expensive, but it really is amazing the detail that is possible. But mobile consumer solutions are getting better and better using LiDAR-enabled iPads or iPhones for rapid research within the field, doing field research. I'm thinking of like choreography coordination across public events. If people are out protesting and they all start synchronizing movements or synchronizing a chant or a movement as they're doing kind of public demonstration. I'm thinking of my colleague, Dr. Shamel Bell, and her street dance activism events in particular, right? These kinds of technology, you can set that up fairly quickly without too many devices to get a capture of that scene. And then there's the software ecosystem to think about. Depthkit and Evercoast. So Evercoast just recently bought Depthkit not too long ago. And Evercoast is now doing higher and higher end captures. So they did the captures for the French Olympics, Paris Olympics not too long ago. And obviously that software and the licensing of that software is quite expensive. I think a Depthkit license is around $3,000, right? And then moving up to Evercoast, even more. Then there's open source options though to consider. So while there are these high-end studios that do this and high-end software that does this, there are some really good open source options. LiveScan 3D, volumetric capture. These are both fantastic, and yes, take a little more time, effort, thought to incorporate, but are free, right? Are open source, and it's a community that's still being supported. I think the volumetric capture's most recent release was in 2024, 2025. So not too long ago. And then you have to think about the processing and display. So Unity, Unreal, or some kind of web XR of how people would then use this data, access this data, be able to experience it. And so the quality and budgetary considerations across this spectrum looks something like this. So for example, the Azure Kinect DK, right, that has that microphone built in, RGB capture, and orientation. This retails for about $1,000 for one of these. So buying multiples of these, significant investment. But you know that you're going to be able to capture at a fairly high level with that array. There's the Microsoft Xbox One Kinect sensor bar that retails for about $50, 50 to $100 depending on Amazon or eBay. And you may have to get like a $25 adapter in order for that to connect to the PC. But if you, again, are buying multiple ones of these, you're not going to get the same kind of quality, but it's the price range, right, is much more attainable. Something in the middle would be the Orbeck, which is what 10 Orbecks were used to do the capture that I showed you in Unity of the fashion model. So that was using the Orbeck, and those retail for about $500. And the key difference here, right? Price plus, adapters, quality of the capture, and the ability to record sound. So the Microsoft Xbox One Kinect sensor bar does not include sound. Again, if sound is an important part of what you're trying to share, then you're going to want to look at one of these other options that do have mics, or thinking of an alternative way to capture sound and pair it, which can get complicated, but again, is something to consider. So let's look at a high-end example and a study actually that was done. So Evercoast recently conducted a technical validation project to explore using 36 red Komodo cameras for high fidelity volumetric video capture. Now, REG cameras, I believe this is what's used by USC's School of Cinema. They're high-end cameras. They're used for filmmaking. You can shoot, regular old films on these. They're fantastic cameras. The project aimed to produce photorealistic 4D human performance captures suitable for high-end markets, including film, VFX, XR, VR and AR, and interactive gaming. So they really wanted to compare these high-end film cameras and their capture to something like the RealSense D455s. Then these are retail for about $400. So these depth cameras versus, which are very lightweight, right? And retail for about the same amount as the Orbex, versus the Red Komodos, which are a cinema camera and they retail at $4,000 each. So they're 10 times more expensive. The Red cameras are 10 times more expensive. And so that's a significant financial investment. So the test was designed to determine if the superior performance, if there was superior performance in image quality, dynamic range, and reconstruction stability, if that justified the additional hardware cost for the high-end markets like film or VFX. And the evaluation aimed to clarify, how much better the Red cameras performed, because we kind of would assume that they did better, but like to what extent? So here's what we saw in terms of the outcome, just to highlight a few things here. Superior fidelity compared to the 29 camera RealSense array that was set up, the Red Komodo rig delivered significantly better image quality, resolution, dynamic range. It successfully captured subtle textures, even down to like skin pores, hair strands. As you can see here, this is the RealSense versus the Red. Her hair just looks, particularly on the baby's head too, right? Like you can almost get a sense of that baby fine hair. But when it comes to like clarity, the logo to me is probably what brands are going to be most excited about, right? In this capture of a dancer, you're able to see a break dancer, you're able to see the Adidas logo so clearly compared to the RealSense, right? It's quite different. The precision synchronization, the test validated that the cameras could maintain perfect time alignment during high motion captures using hardwired gen lock and time code. And this eliminated common issues like motion tearing, jittering, and occlusion errors that tend to happen when you're doing volumetric capture. In terms of the monocular reconstruction, unlike systems that rely on depth sensors, the Red array relied solely on monocular image data. And despite that, the Gaussian splatting that Evercoast uses, their pipeline, produced cleaner and more stable volumetric reconstruction. So again, we're seeing Gaussian splatting being used more frequently within these pipelines, and it's producing really solid results. So again, something for us to consider. Any questions before I wrap up with some interesting additional use cases? All right, well, let me just dive in here. So this first one, this is a project called Preserving BIPOC Expatriates, Memories During Wartime and Beyond. It was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. So it explores the use of volumetric video capture to document and preserve the stories of lesser known historical figures, such as World War II veterans. And this initiative brings together performance studies, digital humanities, and archive sciences to create immersive experiences that enliven traditional archives. So you can take a look at, this is the presentation that I attended at the ITCH conference that was held at USC. But I just want to highlight a couple of things about this project in particular that I think are useful for us to think about when we're doing this kind of work and how this work plays out. So first, there's some workflow and production challenges that they shared about. Capturing volumetric video is described as being similar to a traditional film shoot involving things like wardrobe and lighting and rehearsals. However, there are some unique challenges. And, first and foremost, there was data management and archiving that they had to think about. The extreme file sizes pose significant storage and sustainability questions. Archivists must decide whether to keep the massive raw files for future higher resolution systems or rely on the compressed derivatives like MP4s, which require sidecar files to maintain their 3D relationships, right? Texture files and such to be able to forward migrate those and play them again. There's physical limitations that they saw happen in terms of the participation or the participant within the study, or within the experience, creating the experience. So the high fidelity capture required the participants to stand for several minutes, which was difficult for their elderly interlocutor, this World War II veteran, Mike Russell in particular, standing for a long time while getting everything set up and throughout the capture, redoing it, all of that. So considering whether or not it makes sense to have someone sit versus stand, I believe in the USC captures with Holocaust survivors, most of those participants are sitting down. But again, that creates for the experience, that's a different relationship. So you have to think of when someone puts on a headset that you might want to encourage them to sit down so that they're seated with the interlocutor, right? As opposed to standing up and needing to be face-to-face with them that way. And then proprietary software dependence on private platforms. In this case, Formavision, it created a black box sort of preservation risk if certain companies go out of business without providing documentation on their file structures, right? How is this going to live on past that particular company, right? They don't have access to that software anymore. And then there's educational and ethical impacts to consider. So the sources highlight that volumetric, in this particular project, highlight the volumetric video creates a sense of authentic presence and intimacy that traditional 2D media lacks. So they talked to students, and students reported that interacting with the volumetric capture felt like having a conversation with a granddad, which led to deeper physical, visceral connections to history. I mean, that's the kind of feedback that we're dying for, right? That we're so excited to hear about. That's what you're hoping for, is to bring these experiences, these histories alive, or to life for people. And when paired with memoirs and traditional oral histories, it creates just a richer and more multisensory learning environment for students. However, there's ethical considerations here. Because volumetric capture or video capture, captures a person's whole biometric form, it raises complex consent issues regarding the potential for AI-driven misuse, such as deep fakes, right? When we're talking about volumetric capture, you're capturing someone's form as in measurements, and you can't copyright measurement. So there's some legal things, right? You can certainly license the data that you have, but because it's measurement, right, you're essentially not able to copyright it unless there's significant creative adjustments that are made. So that's something to consider of how do we protect people who consent to being captured in this way. Then there's questions of agency and care. The intensive rehearsal process required by the technology's time limit. So often only 3 to 4 minutes was what this particular team was able to do. That led to tighter, more collaborative relationship between the interviewer and the subject, ensuring that the story was told accurately and with ethics of care, but also within the 3 to 4 minute time range that they had, right? So as you could see from my capture, just doing 30 seconds resulted in a lot of data. So if you're doing 3 to 4 minutes, right, that's a massive amount of data, but a very little time to tell a story, especially if you're working with an older interlocutor. It's harder for them to be concise. I myself often go over time when it comes to workshops and things, right? It's hard to be concise. That requires a lot of honing in order to do that. And there's also the question of like, okay, how much of that then is an active interpretation, right? How much intervention is happening in order for that to be captured in such a limited amount of time. So we have to think about these things when we're thinking about incorporating them into research. On the other end of the spectrum, I did want to bring up something from the medical side of things here, and some case studies of how we're seeing this play out in the medical field for medical training. John Hopkins extended reality learning hub for MetaQuest headset is one way that people are training for clinical readiness. At their School of Nursing, spatial data is being integrated into their XR hub via the MetaQuest headset. And this allows students to observe emotional nuances, such as, maybe patients' hesitation or a reassuring gesture, which are often lost in traditional role play or 2D lectures, right? Not everyone's an actor. So in this case, you can get really good captures. You can think about people who are really good at communicating certain kind of nuance that maybe wouldn't play out if you just gave someone a script and said, hey, pretend that you have this kind of medical condition, or you're a particularly grumpy patient today, right? In this case, we can do higher end, more realistic captures, and that's going to help people practice more and more in terms of that lifelike, scene that's going to play out when they're working as a nurse. And it really helps to bridge that gap between classroom instruction and the high stakes environment of a hospital. So then Providence has come up with immersive. Sorry, that always gets me. Their trademark hero name always gets me, but immersive. It's an enhanced e-learning soft skills training. So through this program, Providence integrates volumetric video into existing learning management systems. So you can see here, right, this is kind of their typical learning management system, but they've got this 3D volumetric capture for students to look at and learn with. And clinicians can use these 3D clips to study body language and posture and facial expression, again, improving their communication and empathy in patient care. So being able to kind of click through and notice certain things about the expression and note that for students as they're getting trained. So then when they're doing their interactives, right, or when they're in their sessions where they're working with patients, they can keep those things in mind, right? They've been attuned to them. And in a holistic sort of way, in a more immersive way than just reading it within a textbook. Hinge Health and True Motion Technology. This is an AI training and computer vision pair up. Hinge Health utilizes EverCoast software to promote ground truth data for its True Motion technology. Unlike flat 2D video, volumetric data captures precise biomechanics and joint angles across diverse body types. So this leads to more accurate feedback for digital physical therapy and musculoskeletal rehabilitation. So essentially, you're able to really see how well a patient is adjusting to physical therapy, right? How that's playing out. And it doesn't always have to be, it can be through video. It doesn't necessarily always have to be in person. Again, helping with the amount of patients that people need to see, the amount of time that people need to come to a clinic. We're trying to serve a larger or wider range of patients. This can be really, really helpful. It can also flag things, right? Because of the AI, it can flag things. So if a patient just does a video of them lifting their arm and sends that in weekly, and the AI is able to say, hey, doctor, this is not, they're not improving in the level that we expect them to. They might be, helps bring attention to that, and they can add additional exercises or things that are needed to address those types of issues. And I've added a couple of other use cases in the notes, but I just wanted to give a spectrum here of, from, as we would say at UCLA, from both North Campus and South Campus, right? From humanities and sciences, to get a sense of how this is being used within research. So before I close out, I just want to note some challenges and constraints. I've tried to note these during the presentation, but I want to draw our attention just as we close out to some of the biggest barriers. So first and foremost, data heaviness. You're dealing with gigabytes of data per second of footage. The reality check for researchers here is the data tax. Unlike a standard Zoom recording, you're capturing millions of XYZ coordinates or points, right, every second. And this requires high-speed SSDs and serious GPUs for processing. So if you're planning a study with 50 participants, you need to have a data management plan that's ready before you can ever hit the record button to know that you're going to be able to handle that much data, petabytes of data. And just to remind you, in terms of the data rate, a single minute of raw volumetric video can exceed 10 to 20 gigabytes easily. So something to keep in mind. Light and occlusion, the blind spot problem, quote unquote, in camera arrays is a big one. Or interference. So infrared sensors can blind each other if not properly phased. So it's something that you want to stay attuned to when you're doing your setups, right? That you're testing a lot in advance to make sure that you're not going to have holes in your data. Because, setting these things up, you might only get a certain amount of time within a rig or within a studio, and it takes a long time to set those things up, or a bit of time, right? Where again, it's getting easier, but a bit of time to set those things up. So you do want to make sure that you're checking for those blind spots and getting as much coverage as you possibly can when you're going through. Or, for example, from another recent EverCoast article about integrating 4D Gaussian splats into Omniverse and Isaac Sims. This was done in 2025. They noted, quote, splats do not currently cast or receive shadows and do not appear in reflections. The splats also cannot blend together when overlaid in the camera view, despite different world positions. So this further reinforces the idea that they are treated as flat visual cards rather than volumetric content. And this limitation restricts their use in photorealistic or physically accurate environments where lighting and interaction is essential. So it's, again, just something to keep in mind what software applications you're applying to your pipeline and what's most important for you in your capture. Cleanup, right? The manual labor of mesh cleaning and hole filling, it's time consuming and can introduce a level of interpretation or guesstimation. So again, that's why I was mentioning previously, try to avoid it in terms of your capture. If you can't, do your best within your cleanup, but give yourself the time to do that. That is a significant part of this pipeline. Editing, stitching things together, it does take some time there. And then ethics, consent in 3D, who owns the digital double, licensing versus copyright when it comes to measurement. As I was mentioning before, it's still a question, and it's something that you will want to address in your IRBs, for example, and make sure that you have a clear way of dealing with that in terms of your data and within terms of the consent that you're having people sign. Also going back to like the DALL-E Lives installation, while DALL-E was a very experimental artist, we can't know exactly how he would feel about being reanimated in this manner. A lot of people are able to with AI now, able to bring people back or animate, sort of Harry Potter-like, right? Animate history through the use of these tools. And there's a question around, even though, for example, with the DALL-E Lives installation, again, the estate approved the project in order for the museum to produce the installation, we don't have DALL-E's direct consent. And there's also deep fake potential here that's really real and ethically murky. So these are just some things I wanted to flag before we closed out for today. Thank you to those who were able to stick around for the whole workshop. If you have any questions, I'd love to talk. That's all I have for today, and I'm happy to open it up for discussion. I do have 6 RealSense devices if anyone is interested. So these Intel guys. So if you're interested, please let me know. I'd love to collaborate and love to hear what you're working on and your ideas for this technology. So thank you so much.